Trump is turning the White House into a golden goose, says Tim O'Brien of Bloomberg News. I'll just add to that Donald Trump is both turning the presidency into his own golden goose and slowly torturing and killing the real golden goose, that is, American democracy. Welcome to Law and Society, and let's talk about this. None of what Donald Trump is doing to enrich himself would happen if he was the president of Liberia or any other country. America is the proverbial golden goose, the land of opportunity that Donald is turning more and more into a land abound with his personal opportunities. The more Donald corrupts the office of the presidency, the more he assaults our buildings and governmental institutions. He's both stealing the goose's golden eggs while choking her to death at the same time. In her letters from an American, Professor Heather Cox Richardson names all the donors publicly disclosed by the White House, and I've provided the letters from an American reference as well as an NBC reference of all the names of all the donors publicly disclosed by the White House for Donald Trump's ballroom. She refers to Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich calling the scheme pay to play. Here's from the letter. Economist Robert Reich notes that the list includes Google, whose CEO thanked Trump for the resolution of an antitrust case, Palantir, which has lucrative contracts with ICE, and Blackstone's Steven Schwarzman, who would profit from Trump's regulatory rollbacks for private equity. And this is what Robert Reich called pay to play. Tim Miller of the Bulwark says, Trump didn't drain the swamp, he joined it. You can listen to his full episode in the link provided below, and he has some pertinent information. And then there was that time that Tim Cook gifted Donald Trump a literal 24-karat gold bar as a stand for his Apple, whatever that was, glass. It was an open bribe that only scratches the surface of all the other dealings between Donald Trump and corporate America. Please check the references in the description box and read the letters and the references. It'll give you a broader idea of what I'm talking about. Because if I were to talk about all of that in detail, it would take hours and hours and days and days. This is where I come to inform you in a brief way so you can get the gist of the information that needs to be soaked in. And then if you have a desire to learn more, I have provided the references. They talk more about Donald's various grifts, all the way from him cashing in based on the weight of the office he now holds. The corruption is hard to keep track of. There are so many, from cryptic crypto schemes to outright demanding the Department of Justice to pay him $230 million for harm caused to him when DOJ prosecuted him. He has likewise pressured media companies and law firms to get multi-million-dollar settlements and millions of dollars in legal services from law firms that capitulated to him when he went after them early on in his rampage. No other country, no other office in the world could give somebody as many proverbial golden eggs than the office of the President of the United States. Donald is exploiting that to the full extent beyond the rule of law. Rife with corruption and in decline, America's democracy keeps chugging along. But for how long? How long before the bottom drops out because of Donald's actions? And what happens then? Will Americans rise up, including his own followers? Or will we accept defeat and let this great experiment called American democracy end? I sure hope we don't accept it. I sure hope there's a limit, a point after which most of the country will speak with one voice. But we're not there yet. And we need to get there fast. Otherwise, Americans are in for a very, very dark upcoming generation. Not just a decade, not just a year, but a generation. A world where America turns into an oligarchical fascist empire, where we lose our individual rights and economic opportunities, where the courts are corrupted and so is the executive and legislative branches, where the Constitution means nothing anymore and the country no longer believes in equal justice under the only incorruptible king a society like ours can have, and that is the rule of law. We are fast approaching a point of lawlessness. It is only still a long way away because American democracy is the modern world's oldest democracy. It has deep roots in the rule of law. Systems of checks and balances, separation of powers are still holding the line in America's lower courts. The press, private enterprise, and the American people love our democracy and all it provides. And here I would like to say not just the press in general, but more specifically the independent press and engaged citizenry has risen up and is rising up. Donald's fascist, selfish, and nihilistic vision of America, where he's the despot ruling over ashes, will not come true, but only if we the people rise up. So at this point, what are the practical things you can do to help? Food pantries and food banks, food kitchens. Donate money or donate your time, donate canned goods, get your friends to donate. I just did that with a couple of friends. If you can't afford it, donate your time. Go help run those places. People will go hungry in the near future because of the shutdown and because of end of SNAP assistance and simply because of the rising cost of living whilst wages stagnate and jobs become less and less available. Actual jobs, good paying jobs, jobs that provide insurance, those are harder and harder to find. Protest peacefully on the streets and on social media. Organize within your community to watch out for one another. And that's happening in the big cities like Chicago and LA, where regular citizens are standing up to DHS ICE tyranny, and they are recording what's happening, and they are being assaulted and illegally assaulted and sprayed with chemical agents, thrown around. Have your alderman or councilman's information and go to them with issues with federal agents. Inform local law enforcement about federal activity and request presence of the police, local police, so they can bear witness and keep the peace. And I'll get to that point when I talk about Governor Pritzker in a minute. If you're out protesting on overpasses, please take extra water with you. Those places get hot and dry. Stay hydrated. Have your phones charged. As I said, record anything suspicious and inform them to the local authorities. Stay informed. Stay connected on social media. Use it as a tool to build cohesion when Donald and MAGA are using it for division. Turn the tables on them in every forum. Always remain peaceful, but use words that cut deep into their souls. Like Donald Trump and his enablers are attacking American democracy from within, and they are enemies of the American people. Not the MAGA followers, but the henchmen and the enablers. I am very specific about who I am talking about, and that is Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, and Tom Homan, Kristi Noem, Pete Hegseth, RFK Jr., these henchmen, and Hassert and Caroline Levitt, who enable him, and the corporate oligarchical America that is coming out in support of an oligarchy, a fascist oligarchy. Those are the enemies of the American people. Donald and his enablers are traitors and seditionists who are undermining our republic, our economy, and disrupting the lives of millions, only to enrich billionaires and take a cut for themselves. Use your words and be heard. And now, as I was writing this, I wrote this, and then I went to bed, and then I woke up, and then there was Stephen Miller threatening Governor Pritzker with seditious conspiracy and telling federal agents that they have complete immunity because of the supremacy clause. The supremacy clause of the Constitution says this Constitution and the laws of the United States and all treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Important part. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So the supremacy clause only comes into play when there is a specific federal statute or constitutional provision that a state goes against directly. And there's no sort of mechanism for the supremacy clause to kick in when there is no federal legislation or constitutional provision or other act of Congress that would contravene that state action. Supremacy clause kicks in when there's a specific law or state regulation that directly contravenes the Constitution, any federal laws or treaties. Absent a direct and specific conflict, the supremacy clause does not simply apply because federal regime decides what you're doing is against the federal government without any proof that any federal regulation or constitutional command forbids it. Doing so would go against the 10th Amendment that leaves all powers not mentioned in the Constitution or in federal law to the states. And that, very importantly, includes state policing power. Now, about the seditious conspiracy bit. The statute says, if two or more persons in any state or territory or in any place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States conspire to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war against them, or to oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, contrary to the authority thereof, they shall be fined under this title and imprisoned for not more than 20 years or both. Well, Governor Pritzker's executive order created a commission that would hold all evidence and record of what federal agents are doing and how they're violating the Constitution and its commands under the 1st, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and if other states are involved in claims of violations of sovereignty rises, then the 14th Amendment. And here I'm talking about the Texas National Guard going into Illinois. I would hope that Illinois would be able to sue Texas to say you cannot have your guard here. It violates our sovereignty. The federal government doesn't have the power to deprive people of their constitutional rights. That is not subject to the Supremacy Clause. If states' police come to keep the peace and stand between the public and federal agents, they're performing their policing duties vested to the states. The question of seditious conspiracy doesn't come into the picture because the commission Pritzker started does nothing to violate any federal law, nor does it conspire in any way to hinder legal federal action. And his instructions to Illinois law enforcement is to keep the peace and bear witness to what's happening, not to obstruct or keep federal agents from doing their lawful duties. But pepper spraying peaceful protesters is not protected federal function. It is assault and it is a crime. Throwing people around, chasing people through neighborhoods, using smoke grenades and chemical agents on peaceful protesters or resistors who demand a judicial warrant are not federal functions. They are abuses by the federal government that encroaches on state police power and the constitutional rights of individuals. Those are not authorized actions under the Constitution or any laws under the Constitution, and does not have the backing of the Supremacy Clause because there's no law that prohibits Illinois from policing the state as the state wishes. The regime's tactics that Stephen Miller and Tom Homan have devised and deployed are not law and are not part of the Constitution. They are part of executive overreach and a beginning of brutalist fascism. Recording these violations and keeping them for later use is as far from seditious conspiracy as one can get. It is execution of state prerogatives as given to states under the 10th Amendment, specifically their policing power. Now, about federal immunity for MAGA, ICE, and DHS. Almost all law enforcement have qualified immunity, but that immunity does not cover illegal actions like violations of constitutional rights and provisions and attacking a peaceful populace without just cause. Those attacks are assault. No law has been passed by Congress that administers DHS ICE police roles in states in the capacity that Donald's using them. We have now gone miles away from his initial immigration excuse and are squarely in territory where presidential powers are not nearly as high as in immigration and foreign affairs. He's targeting Americans and peaceful protesters. That is against the First Amendment. His goons are disappearing people without due process of law or access to counsel. Those are constitutional violations that are not protected by the Supremacy Clause or any other clause in the Constitution. But do you know who committed seditious conspiracy? The Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And guess who pardoned those seditionists? Donald Trump. I maintain to this day that a seditious conspiracy charge wasn't brought against Donald Trump because his enablers and co-conspirators had destroyed evidence to prove a link between the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. That link was tacitly reestablished when Donald pardoned them. So in a court of public opinion, it is Donald who committed sedition, not Pritzker. One final thing about this seditious conspiracy bit. Miller's push for seditious conspiracy harkens back to the World War I times when Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1918. In fact, NSPM 7 is very much like the operation of the Sedition Act of 1918, and how Donald and Stephen see it as their roles is much more akin to the repealed Sedition Act of 1918, a vast dragnet that restricted speech. That is why the law was repealed in 1921, and now we have 18 U.S.C. 2384 for specific conspiracy to overthrow the government, like Donald Trump tried on January 6, 2021, and conduct that the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys followed through on. Under today's law, calling what Pritzker is doing seditious conspiracy, in contrast with what Donald Trump and his Oath Keepers and Proud Boys did, is a farce. A third and last quick note, news just came that apparently a private entity had donated $130 million to the Department of Defense, to the Pentagon, to pay for the military during the shutdown. First of all, that is a very small amount of money that will really not do much good for paying this massive operation that is the Defense Department and all our military. But it is a fishy thing. I haven't heard of this ever happening before. It compromises the integrity of the military, and there's a private enterprise piercing into our government when our government is ours. It's not for any private entity, whether that be them donating money for the good of the country or not. How about you don't donate the $130 million and pay for your fair share in taxes? That would help the American people a heck of a lot more. I haven't heard of this ever happening. Compromises the integrity, like I said, and I am not aware of any time in the last 100 years that this has happened. So we should keep our eyes on this particular thing about the Pentagon payment, try to find out who made the payment and essentially give that money back because I believe it's a corruption of the Department of Defense by piercing the government veil and putting private enterprise into government, much like Donald Trump is doing with funding, saying that the funding of the ballroom and now that arch that he's building planning on building next to the Lincoln Memorial from private oligarchical donors. It just is not how our federal government and institutions have built the historic city of Washington, D.C. With that said, please keep paying attention, do whatever you can, spread the word, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I will talk to you soon.